Today, when most people think of sloths, they picture adorable defenseless creatures that hang upside down and move at a pace that would make paint drying look exciting. But 10,000 years ago, if you stumbled upon a sloth, you'd likely start running for your life in the opposite direction, as these beasts were not the cute munchkins of today, but rather some of the most titanic mammals to ever walk the planet. And of all these prehistoric giants, none were more impressive than the Eremotherium, a multi-tonned absolute unit that makes modern sloths look like, well, sit from Ice Age. These behemoths roamed the Americas between 5 million and 10,000 years ago, during the Pliocene and late Pleistocene epochs. And unlike their modern tree-dwelling relatives, they would have snapped any tree they tried to climb like a twig. And you'd think that due to their size, they'd be quickly recognized as the monsters they were. But the discovery of Eremotherium was a confusing one. The first fossils were found way back in 1823, in the US and Georgia. But nobody actually realized what they had found. Instead, they were routinely misclassified, with one fossil even being used as proof for a new species of turtle, which wasn't even fixed until over 130 years later. It was only in 1948 that then Austrian paleontologist Franz Spillmann finally created a new genus named Eremotherium, after finding fossils in Ecuador, with a genus name meaning desert beast, referring to the area where it was found. But even then, due to all of the errors and misclassifications, Eremotherium was always overshadowed by Megatherium, a closely related giant sloth who was once thought to be the big brother of the Eremotherium, having held the title for the largest sloth of all time. But in 2023, researchers realized that we had it all wrong, and Eremotherium was really the true giant. And I mean that in the most literal sense.
You mean figuratively?
No, I literally mean literally.
As these behemoths were found to measure up to 6 meters or 20 feet in length, and stand over 2 meters or 6.5 feet tall. And that's on all fours, mind you. As when they decided to rear up on their hind legs, which they likely routinely did, they could stretch to a mind-blowing 4 meters or 13 feet high into the air. In other words, as tall as a freaking giraffe. And it probably comes as no surprise that with this height, their weight wasn't exactly far behind, as these guys were absolute chunksters, tipping the scales at a weight of 6,000 kilograms or 13,000 pounds, which makes them, by the way, not only one of the largest terrestrial mammals of all time, but also heavier than the average African elephant, the world's current heaviest land animal. And to support this monumental mass, Eremotherium had an incredibly robust skeletal structure. For example, its femur measured 45.1 centimeters in width, which might not sound crazy, but to put that into perspective, a human's femur has an average width of 2.34 centimeters, meaning their femur was about 20 times wider. And here's the real kicker. The average width of a T-Rex's femur was only 36.2 centimeters, meaning their Eremotherium's femur was 25% bigger than that of even a T-Rex. So in other words, they were built like tanks, and their limbs were built like tree trunks. In fact, even their tail vertebrae were massive, particularly near the front, which also suggests that it was equipped with powerful muscles, which was likely used to help them balance when standing, almost like a third leg. And speaking of standing, Eremotherium had a very peculiar way of getting around. Unlike modern sloths, which spend most of their lives dangling from tree branches, this prehistoric beast was fully terrestrial. But just because it walked on land does not mean it did so normally. Instead of placing the soles of their feet flat on the ground like humans, or even walking on its toes like big cats, Eremotherium had an unusual method called pedolateral locomotion, which is basically complicated terminology meaning that it walked on the outer edges of its feet. Now, if you were to try this yourself, you'd probably end up with a sprained ankle in about 5 minutes. But for Eremotherium, it was a necessary adaptation, as it helped distribute its enormous weight across its limbs, while also keeping its massive claws from constantly dragging on the ground. And to accommodate this strange walking style, its metacarpals and metatarsals were highly specialized, allowing it to bear weight on the outer edges of its feet without tipping over. However, unsurprisingly, this unconventional stance did have its drawbacks. Chief among them was that Eremotherium wasn't exactly built for speed. Just like its contemporary brethren, this giant sloth was a true slowpoke, likely moving at an unhurried pace throughout the day. But then again, when you weigh over 6 tons, speed is probably the least of your concerns. The skull was equally as robust as well, being built like a literal brick, measuring up to 33 centimeters or 1.1 feet wide, and 65 centimeters or 2.1 feet in length, so longer than the average katana. It also had large bony protrusions along its skull, with one by the zygomatic arch being described as an absolutely massive bony outgrowth. And while we can't say for sure what its face looked like, it does seem to have one that perhaps only a mother could love, if even that. The dental situation was equally odd. Eremotherium had what scientists called homodont teeth, which is rather rare in mammals. It means that they had all roughly the same shape and function, unlike our varied collection of incisors, canines, and molars, on the other hand. And each one of their teeth looked roughly like a molar, except with 2 sharp ridges that could grow to be over 8 inches tall. But here's where things get really weird, because their teeth had no enamel whatsoever. Instead, they were composed of 3 different tissues: orthodentin, vasodentin, and cementum. The hardest of these, orthodentin, formed a thin outer layer that allowed Eremotherium's teeth to be self-sharpening. Plus, their teeth had no roots and continue to grow throughout their lives. So basically imagine self-sharpening giant teeth that continue to grow forever. Yeah,